camping always has the potential to be kinda creepy. I love it. Being alone in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but a tent between me and the elements. I find it incredibly refreshing to get away from the rest of humanity like that. Yet, I would be the first to admit that in being so isolated, it is easy to go from calm and relaxed to panicked and expecting death with nothing more than the sound of a twig snapping. But it is worth it, and I take all the safety precautions I can. My family knows my travel plans, my up-to-date maps. I check in via satellite phone regularly. I hire a recently serviced vehicle, spare wheels, spare fuel, spare water, and all the rest. Plus, I always have enough medical supplies to start a small hospital. I also do a whole lot of research, so I know the area. Mostly the weather, the politics, and the local flora and fauna. I was travelling to a particularly snake and spider infested part of Australia, so that last one was a particularly high priority for this trip. I make a bit of money as a freelance nature photographer, so I was hoping the spring season would get me some good shots of wildlife. But despite feeling pretty organised, despite never having had any major problems while camping in the past, there is one thing that I will never neglect looking into again. Local folklore. Right, yeah, laugh if you want. But let me tell you about my time camping in the Australian outback. It had been a rough day of driving. I felt like every one of my joints was compressed from the Land Rover bouncing over the rough, corrugated tracks. And the weather had been particularly hot and dry, even more than usual. 4 days into my 2-week trek across the desert, and I was sunburned, blistered, and covered in little bites from gnats and mosquitoes, which no amounts of sunscreen or insect repellent seemed to protect against. I considered it all worth it though. The landscape, it is spectacular, like nothing I'd seen before. When I stopped for lunch, there were panoramic views of red-earthed land so flat that you could see for miles, completely uninterrupted, except for low-growing grasses and the occasional silvery paperbark tree. I could make out one distant peak. It definitely wasn't a mountain. I would even hesitate to say hill. It must have been less than 500 foot high, but it stood out in the otherwise flat landscape. I decided to drive towards it and camp nearby. I could try getting normal phone reception from the top, as well as take some beautiful photos of the desert at sunset. I arrived at the base. It was late afternoon, so I set up my tent on the flat, hard soil before gathering my gear to climb the hill. It was relatively easy to scramble up. I'd changed into trousers before leaving, despite the heat, because the temperature always dropped so suddenly in the desert. I was grateful for this later, as my knees were somewhat protected as I hauled myself over rocks and through thorny bushes. My hands were stained the same bright red as the soil by the time I neared the top, and I suspected the rest of me was too. I could even feel the grit permeating my mouth. There was no regular reception, but I wasn't worried. I still had the satellite phone if I needed it. The top of this hill, it made for a great vantage point for pictures, but the sun was still a little while off that beautiful dusky lighting, so I had a bit of a look around. The hill was mostly barren rock, but small, determined shrubs found room to grow, albeit withered and stunted, in the slightest of cracks. On the far side, I discovered a small hollow of a cave. It was narrow at the mouth, but it rapidly got wider further in. I yelled, and I stomped in an attempt to ascertain if there were any wildlife, but there was no sound in response. Crouching down, I shuffled in. It smelled sour and like rotting meat. My boots knocked against something solid which clattered away like dropped cutlery. Flicking on my torch, I saw that it was a pile of bones, ranging vastly in size. They looked recent, and they were not entirely devoid of flesh. Disgusted, I covered my mouth and nose with my hand and quickly swung the light around to assure myself that I was in fact alone. Dingoes, I suspected, nocturnal and already out hunting for the night. There were bones scattered throughout the cave, sometimes at random, sometimes in little piles, as well as partially eaten animal carcasses. Small mammals mostly, and the better part of a big kangaroo. Slight depressions and hollows in the dust indicated where the animals must lay. I didn't linger, knowing my scent would already cause the dingoes some consternation when they returned. Although, like any wild dogs, I knew dingoes could be vicious, I wasn't worried camping so close. They looked very well fed. They weren't the type of animal to pick fights with humans unprompted. Outside, I got a couple of shots of a wedge-tail eagle before it flew quickly east and, eventually, shots of the sun setting over the desert plains. I had expected to see more wildlife. This was the least populated part of the desert so far. Apart from the carcasses in the cave, I hadn't seen any mobs of kangaroos, nor a common busted bird all day. Not good for photography. It seemed that here, even the flies and the ants were not pestering me. It was peaceful, laying back on a rock, watching the stars emerge one by one, and knowing that I was the only human being for hundreds of kilometers. Desolate, nearly uninhabitable expanses of wilderness in every direction. It makes you feel like you're on another planet. It can make me uneasy at times, but mostly it feels liberating to be so isolated, and I was happy. Eventually I had to climb down before I lost all visibility. Night had fallen like a blanket, painting the luminous landscape in shades of grey and navy. I had left an electric lantern on my table at camp, so with no obstructions in the plane, it was easy to get back to the car in the dark. But as I walked, occasionally losing my footing on loose stones or in burrows of animals, I saw the lantern fall from the table, off in the distance. No, it didn't fall. It arced upwards before falling to the ground, the light going dim. Those things are heavy and hardy. It would be difficult for the wind to knock it over, let alone pick it up and drop it with force enough to break it. I stood, poised in the dark. It wasn't pitch black. The light from the stars and the sliver of a moon illuminated the outline of the car, glinted off the metal fastenings of the tent. Behind me, the hill was a dark mass of looming, impenetrable shadows. I picked up the pace, jogging as carefully as I could. I considered waving my arms, yelling, shining my torch, anything to try and frighten away any dingoes that might be lingering. But I also didn't really want to aggravate them. Besides, I couldn't see any sign of movement in the campsite. This was confirmed when I arrived. Apart from the lantern, nothing was disturbed. But the lantern, it looked like it had been crushed underfoot. But seriously, it would have taken a massive amount of weight to achieve that. A second later, I nearly jumped out of my skin when in the distance, the most bone-chilling sound that I have ever heard reverberated through the night. High-pitched, undulating cries, rising and falling in a mass chorus. I was already jittery, so it took me a second to realize it must be dingoes howling. But they sounded so distant, when surely they had been in my campsite only moments before. Nothing could move that fast. The cold, still, night air, it carried the calls from what sounded like miles away. Hairs stood up on the back of my neck, and the long howls only added to my growing anxiety. I did several things then. I made sure that I had my car keys in my pocket, and I dragged my sleeping bag out of the tent and made room for it on the back seat to sleep in there. At least the car would block out the sounds of the dogs better than a tent. Then, I climbed onto the roof of the car and I adjusted the spotlight I had attached. It was good for providing emergency light, and I often used it to look for animal eyes at night near my camp. Usually, I enjoyed this interaction with nature, but that night, I was bloody nervous. With some trepidation, I moved the beam of light around the clearing, straining my eyes for any glint of reflection that would indicate the presence of another creature. I thought there was nothing, but the very top of the light caught something. It was so brief that I wondered if I had imagined it. I swung the beam higher and higher, beyond the height of a dingo, far beyond the height of a human. And I saw it again. Two milky white, perfectly round dots in the dark. I was frozen stiff with shock, until they tilted suddenly. I jumped, the spotlight jerking to one side with me, where I saw more of the eyes. These ones, close enough that I could make out shadowed, impossibly lanky, humanoid frames with elongated limbs. With the light on them, they too jerked their heads as though to look at me, eyes glinting white and luminescent like pearls. I turned the light off instantly. It was stupid, but all I could think was that I did not want to see them anymore. The darkness embraced me even more thoroughly now that my eyes had grown accustomed to such bright light. I blinked, desperately trying to discern any movement nearby, while simultaneously dreading seeing anything. In the distance, the howls cut off abruptly. Now, my own ragged breathing was the only sound. Strange, when usually the nights here were hosted choirs of insects chirping. With a sudden rush of adrenaline and an instinct warning me to move, I pitched myself from the roof of the car. I didn't climb, I threw myself off. I hit the ground hard on one shoulder, staggered upright, and started fumbling for my keys. I heard a rumbling sound, deep and building like an avalanche, and I realized that the ground was shaking. Wrenching open the door, I heard ripping nearby. I didn't have to turn around to know it was my tent being shredded. With my lungs straining, heart pounding, and the contents of my stomach doing a rolling impersonation of the Spanish Armada, I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine stuttered to life. The headlights blinked on. There was nothing in front of the car. My relief, it did not last. An immense scraping sound came from the back of the Land Rover, and then the twisting shriek of metal being mutilated. I yanked at the gearbox, fumbling to get the car into drive, while simultaneously looking in the rearview mirror. I couldn't see anything past the luggage I'd piled up to the roof, But the scraping at the back of the vehicle, it continued, like something was trying to claw its way inside. When I heard the sound of glass smashing, I finally slammed my foot onto the gas and began to hurtle back in the direction I'd come that day. It wasn't long before I nearly rolled the car as the right-hand side dipped into a dry creek bed at high speed. I swerved, by some luck managing to regain control, and I slowed my pace considerably. Never had I had to exert more self-control. Every instinct was telling me to keep moving as fast as possible. But my more rational side knew that getting out in one piece was just as important. Every time I glanced into the side mirrors, I expected to see something in pursuit. I drove through the night, my hands gripping the wheel like vices, jumping at the silhouette of every tree. As the light of dawn broke and my breath puffed up in clouds in the morning chill, I saw what I'd been looking for. A fence indicating a nearby cattle station that I had stopped at to refill my water the previous morning. I drove up to the property. The owner was bundled up in a woolen jumper, leaning back on the veranda steps, hot coffee in hand. He watched me approach, bemused, but leapt up to help me when I all but fell out of the car. Once he had ascertained that I wasn't actually injured, he sat me down at his kitchen table, spooned instant coffee into a second mug, and reboiled the kettle without any further questions. Eventually, I spoke. Something strange happened to me last night. Yeah. I was taken aback by his response. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an assumption. It was just casual acceptance. You strayed west. Maybe. I don't know. The track wasn't distinct. Nah, you did for sure. Quinkin territory. Excuse me, what territory? I wasn't sure if he was just being sarcastic or if he was actually serious. My people, we don't go there. Haven't for thousands of years. Quinkin spirits. Too much mischief. He shrugged. I saw these things, like humans but tall, thin. He was nodding, unperturbed. I felt so shaken, the echoes of the metal ripping, ringing in my ears. He passed me a coffee and he left the room. A little while later, when my coffee was almost gone, he came back with a photo of some cave paintings. Something like that, yeah, you're right, I told him. I couldn't believe I was actually having this conversation. Speaking of caves, I found a dingo cave too, on a hill, full of dead animals. Animals? Bones, yeah? No, bits of kangaroo and the likes. Dingoes wouldn't leave meat on a carcass. I shifted, uncomfortably in my chair, unsure of how to reply. Thanks for the coffee, mate. I should probably check the damage to the car and get going. Damage? Yeah, I reckon one of those krakens or whatever you said had a go at my tent in the Rover. Something scared me half to death anyhow. Quenkin, he corrected me automatically, then went silent. He watched me carefully for a minute before picking up the empty mugs and putting them on the sink. He ran a hand through his curly dark hair and then shook his head. Don't sound like them. They are spirits, but they're usually not malicious. I'll check out your car. We went outside and looked. The spare wheel, metal casing, and everything had been ripped off. Windows smashed. The boot door hung slightly crooked on its hinges, and half of my luggage must have fallen out as I drove. There were broad claw marks stretched across the paint. Deep indentations, and finally, punctures in the metal. I don't think this was a dingo. Do you think it was one of those things? Quentkins wouldn't do this. They're cheeky buggers, but they might have been trying to warn you. Warn me about what? I asked, after hesitating to decide whether I really wanted to know after all. Taramali, I reckon. He's like 'em, but he different. He cleared his throat. My grandfather said, when the ground shakes and animals flee, you know Taramali is near. You're one lucky fella, that he was more interested in the tent than you. He ran a hand deftly over the claw marks gouged in the car. It was shocking how small his fingers looked in the breadth of the gash. What is... He cut me off, putting a hand on my shoulder. He looked me dead in the eye, expression serious as a heart attack. I'd reckon he's got your scent though, mate. You should get a move on. I decided not to ask any more questions. I left immediately, and I kept driving back the original way I'd come until I intersected a highway. From there, I went to the nearest city, booked a flight, and cut my trip short. The local indigenous people knew something about that hill, knowledge that saw them, and even their ancestors today, giving that place a wide berth. Who better to learn the dangers of the land than from those who have lived on it for over 70,000 years? Next time I camp, I will be much more mindful of ancient warnings, and I would recommend that you do the same.